In August 2006, my dad called to tell me that they found a lump the size of a grapefruit in his chest. Small cell lung cancer. They gave him a year to live, but just a few years earlier, my mom had been given the same prognosis and she only lived 3 months. I had been raised by my mom. She was a fantastic mom, and it killed me when she died. When I got off the phone with my dad, I knew he was going to die. There was no question. And what I told myself in that moment was, at least it won't be as devastating as it was when Mom died. My mom and dad got divorced when I was 4. All that I remember from before the divorce is screaming and crying. My dad screaming and me crying. He wasn't a bad man, it was just a bad marriage, and I was the last of 3 kids who all added stress to an unhappy situation. I got yelled at a lot. I was afraid of my dad all the time before the divorce. After he moved out, everything changed. I was 4 and only got to see my dad on the weekends, sometimes not even every weekend, and so he became my hero. He became the thing I wanted most in the world, the person I wanted to see the most, and my life became a waiting game. On weekends, when I knew he was coming, I would sit in the front window and watch for him. I don't know how many hours went by this way every weekend, but it felt like forever. My dad lived about 2 hours away in North Jersey, and I know he would call to let us know when he was coming, and this was also before cell phones, so I would start watching after he called. I'd sit in the front window, and as each car would approach the house, I'd start chanting, "Daddy's car? Daddy's car? Daddy's car?" And then as it would drive by, I'd just say, "Not Daddy." He was always late. I was always heartbroken because he never showed up when he said he would. I remember my mom and dad arguing about it, the many apologies I had from my dad, and forgiving him always for many years, until finally it sunk in. He wasn't going to be there for me. He wasn't going to show up on time, and so I stopped waiting. I loved my dad, and he deserved another chance. So as a teenager, it was up to me if I wanted to spend my weekends with my father. My brother and sister are both older, so they were leading their own lives. Our weekly visits turned into monthly visits, and sometimes not even that. He didn't yell so much anymore, and I wasn't afraid of him anymore, but I had lost that hero worship. I had started to see him as a man. He was bad-tempered, he drank too much, he'd made a lot of mistakes in his life and sometimes acted as if his kids were some of them. I'm not saying he didn't love us, but by never being on time, by sticking us in front of the TV, or going off to spend time with his brothers and sisters on our few precious hours together, he made me feel like a responsibility, not like the most important person in the world to him. I played this game with him, sort of a test. I stopped calling him. I don't know how many weeks went by before he finally called, but when he did, he gave me a guilt trip. He said, "What's the matter? You can't call your father anymore?" I said, "I could say the same to you, Dad. You didn't miss me?" He said, "I was waiting for you to call. If you want to talk to your father, you should call him." And I did want to talk to him, but what I wanted more was for him to want to talk to me. So I went back to testing him. I went back to waiting for him to call, and that's when our relationship really fell apart because he failed. I moved to Virginia in 2000, and I think he visited me maybe 3 times since then. The rule stood. If I wanted him, I had to go to him, which I didn't very often. He was generally unhappy and uncomfortable to be around. Our relationship became one of holiday visits, occasional phone calls, and the rare family outing. But something changed in my dad when he found out he was dying. Facing his own mortality, he came alive. He fought hard to live. He blew all the records out of the water. He survived a year, and then another, and then 2 more. He became the poster boy for chemo, and he went to treatment and therapy in the pharmacy like it was his job, and he had always been good at his job. Once he felt physically strong enough, he started working on his personal life. He got his sense of humor back. He flirted with the nurses, and all the nurses loved him. We talked a lot. He asked me questions, gave me advice, and won over my then boyfriend, now husband. I mean, everyone had always loved my mom, but never my dad before. He got to know his grandkids, and he tried very hard to hold his temper. We talked a lot about what it was like for him after the divorce, having to live so far away, working to make a living for us, never getting to see us. I had a whole new perspective on my childhood through his eyes. And he never waited for me to call him anymore. He'd call me every day if he hadn't heard from me. I played another game with him. He started saying, "I love you," at the end of every phone call, but he'd always forget and say goodbye first. So he'd say goodbye, and I'd say goodbye, and I'd go to hang up, and as I was hanging up the phone, I'd hear him say, "I love you." So, of course, I needed him to know I heard him, so I'd call him back and say, "I love you too," and then we'd both laugh and hang up again. So I began waiting at the end of every phone call, waiting for him to say, "I love you," before hanging up, and he never let me down. As his cancer got worse, he and I grew closer. I'd go up to see him just about every weekend, and I'd always call to let him know when I was getting in the car. And invariably, he'd ask, "Oh, are you crossing the Delaware?" which is the halfway point between here and there. And I'd have to say, "No, Dad, I'm just getting in the car now." He was always waiting for me, and I was always late. I'd spend the weekend, sometimes longer, and we'd have a great time just hanging out. Leaving was the hard part. He always seemed to forget that I was leaving when I said I was leaving. So if it was Sunday, he'd say, "I thought you were staying until Monday." If it was lunchtime, he'd say, "Oh, I'm making a sauce for dinner, you gotta stay for that." And then when I'd get in the car to go, he'd come out on the front porch and stand there waving at me until I could no longer see him in my rearview mirror. It made me cry every time. Not only because it was so hard for me to leave him, but because I knew how hard it was for him to watch me leave. When I was a little girl, I would stand at the front door and watch as my daddy drove away. But something inside of me would break each time as he pulled out of the driveway, and I would run onto the front lawn and start chasing him down the street, running on the sidewalk, yelling and waving, "Bye, Daddy, bye, Daddy," until I could no longer keep up. When I used to think about that memory, I used to get so angry that he could have left me like that he could have just driven away with his daughter chasing him down the street. But now, when I think about it, all I can think is how hard it must have been for him to drive away each time, just like it was so hard for me all those years later. When my dad died, I was devastated. He may not have beaten cancer, but he found a way to heal both of us.